With Caesar's power ever expanding, the Western faction's worry increased at the same time. Therefore, it came as a brief shrew of relief when it was revealed that Caesar's next ambitions were to the south. Below the conquered territory held by Caesar, there were multiple Hispanic-controlled factions, and since Caesar had already meddled within the territories of the cowboys to the west, he figured nearby lands were up for the taking as well. But the war would arrive at the NCR's doorstep eventually, and when it did, for the Desert Rangers, it would be a battle long from home and one of attrition. Thus, Hellraiser hired Frank Asbuth, an expert in army logistics, to come up with a plan to create an efficient system to counter this issue. Word had it amongst traders and travelers that the Hispanic factions might unite against the might of Caesar, but some dismissed these rumors as just another story made out of thin air. With the Ranger army having grown a lot since the migrations of NCR citizens from the border, it was time to create another army to divide the forces. This new army would be led by General Francis Rhodes. He fought in both wars against the Jackals and the Vipers, and had quite the reputation and kill count under his belt. As the war against Caesar's forces still seemed months away, there were some who wanted to build and expand the Ranger war effort and power from within. But to others, it seemed like the opportune moment to get familiar with new allies and integrate themselves within their ranks and systems, since time was on their side. And thus, after much debate, the NCR Integration Treaty came to be. The Desert Rangers would from then be known as the NCR Rangers, and be tasked with defending Nevada and the NCR as a whole. In return, they would get funding, intel, and protection by the main NCR forces. By July the 2nd, it became clear on what faction Caesar would attack first. The Pesos colony, all the way at the east, would have to defend its home against the invader. The NCR saw this as the perfect time to make a push east as well to get closer towards Caesar. Preparations were made to invade the territory of the Rapids, as Caesar was occupied with preparations against the colony and most likely another faction down south. At the end of the month, the war declaration by Caesar went out officially, as his men were thirsting for blood once more. The rumor about a possible unification of the southern factions proved to be false all along. And indeed, as predicted, Caesar once again issued a second war at the same time, a war with the neighboring Baudelio ranchers. That gave the NCR even more time to deal with the Rapids, a war they assumed would not last very long. In the third week of August, war was officially declared against them. By the fourth day of the war, the Rapids had almost lost 50% of their held territory already. They were fighting a behemoth they could not hope to even dent. With the treaty now being complete and the Desert Rangers officially being accepted to the NCR, intel on troops' positions became available to the Rangers as well. It gave them a good sense of how powerful the NCR really was, and the incredible size of their armies everywhere. Following their acceptance into the NCR, the Desert Rangers had gained a massive increase in funding, as they have earned a sizable chunk of the NCR's military budget for that year. This, coupled with Hellraiser's demands for increased military funding, had brought prosperity to the Nevada people, and as a result, 6 new workshops were built across their territory, giving the people work and economy to go into circulation. The war against the Rapids did not even last a full week, and by the end, the NCR were, unsurprisingly, victorious. Due to the heavy bombing and combat, the territory formerly held by the Rapids had become impassable, and the NCR troops were now forced to create a perimeter and front line beside it. With the front line now shifting around the Rapids area, Hellraiser sent in the first of his forces towards the front as well. Around 4,000 troops took part in the giant migration, but they felt safer than ever as the NCR held territory felt as their second home. As the troops walked across the wasteland, they witnessed the NCR expanding their infrastructure to make everything smoother towards the east. In the first week of September, the Rangers had arrived at the front. Though Caesar was having his war to the south, He always had units stationed here too, since he was well aware of the NCR's intent. All things were pointing towards the fact that the war against the Pesos colony might be over before preparations were complete to declare war on the neighboring faction to the west. With the initialization of robots to fight at the front as well, it was now time to create the schematics to upgrade the models to make them more combat effective. The Protectron Mark II would be tougher to take down and able to kill more effectively than its predecessor. At the same time, with so many men gone to the front, it was of the utmost importance that the Desert Ranger territory would be self-sustaining, and thus stricter rules on schools, education, and instruction were given to ensure that the citizens had the knowledge and expertise to govern their villages and towns without the complete protection from the Ranger army. By the end of September, Caesar launched his invasion on the Baudilio ranchers, who held lands with a nice wide border for Caesar to put his troops along. He assumed victory here would be easier, since it would be difficult for his enemy to hold a line that wide. The very next day, the Pesos colony fell, and troops stationed here moved westward to attack the ranchers from two directions. Caesar's next move was, as expected, a bit more low profile. Chances were ever getting higher that his next target would be the NCR. But before that happened, more facilities needed to be built, including arms workshops, to provide his men with the necessary amount of weapons. Everyone was holding in their breath on what Caesar would do next after surely claiming a victory over the ranchers. The NCR army arrived in droves at the border, building trenches, bunkers, and erecting defensive positions. Since the Desert Rangers were not entangled in a war for some time, their production reserves were great. They had started the robot production, and Hellraiser ordered the first robot army to be built, consisting of 600 robots. It would take some time to produce this, but once they were built, they did not require food or water to function. The war against the ranchers lasted for almost a month. They stood no chance, and Caesar easily split their faction down the middle to deliver a devastating death blow. Since so many of the Desert Rangers were stationed in NCR territory, it was expected of them to still train and exercise while waiting for the enemy to strike. Training would be given by the higher-ups of the NCR Ranger Corps. They were similar to the units of the Desert Rangers, albeit a bit more militant when it came to their core ideals. In the first week of November, the ranchers had officially lost the war to Caesar, who was still in the process of creating workshops for upcoming conflicts. Counterplans had been made by the NCR officers in case war would break out. The Desert Rangers were not strong enough to fight the enemy on their own, but would mostly function as defensive units that would hold the bunkers and trenches. The NCR was mirroring Caesar's movements, as they too created two new arms workshops. The two factions were so massive when it came to their manpower and numbers that weapon resupply could make a huge difference on who dominated the battlefield. As plans were made earlier to maintain the Desert Ranger territory without the overwatch of the armed troops, it was time to reorganize internally even more. Plans would be discussed on several topics regarding the future of the Desert Ranger supply strength and direction of research and priority. The first of the robotic units were finally completed and would wait for further instructions until being sent out to the front. The neighboring NCR started a military campaign labeled the Bear Roars to steamroll their troops ready to face their most powerful enemy yet. Hellraiser did not have the funding to do a similar campaign, but instead hired Joseph Foster, a specialist in military offensive, to teach his troops more on aggressive combat tactics. Where some thought Caesar was now ready to declare war on the NCR to the west, instead, he felt that more arms workshops needed to be built first. It had people worried, since even Caesar, high above his own power and might, took his next confrontation very serious and delicately. Stonewall Farnsworth was chosen to be the overseer of the robotic army for the Desert Rangers. He had 600 units under his command, including some engineers for if the robots would break down during combat. With the reorganization, one of the first steps that was made was the hiring of a new recruitment strategist who would hopefully help with an increase in volunteers joining the armed forces. By February the 23rd, the Mark II Protectrons were finally done in terms of pre-production and now were sent out to replace or upgrade existing units in Farnsworth's army. The biggest war the Wasteland had yet seen had not begun yet, but time would run out eventually.